Anyways, okay. Welcome to another cover seminar. We're joined today by Giovanni Marmont, who I believe I first met you at an affect theory conference in, what was the town in Pennsylvania? I've actually forgotten. Was it
Lancaster?
Lancaster? Yes, Lancaster.
Yeah, that's right.
So you're going to present some of the work you've been doing about affect theory, the undercommons, and design. And I'm going to hand it over to you because someone is knocking on my front door. Of course, this happens right at this moment.
We'll come to your rescue then and try to share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see what I'm sharing? Yeah, great. Okay. Okay, well, thanks to those of you who turned up today. Really appreciate it. And yeah, so what I would like to do is that I would like to talk about a book project I've been working on, which touches on a few themes that I hope are of interest to some of you that are either part of the COVA research cluster or that are kind of adjacent to it in some ways. I should mention right away that the book that I'll be talking about is not quite complete yet, even though the finishing line is kind of now quite firmly in sight. It's only a few months away, a couple of months away, in fact. So please bear with me if, as I was saying to Stephen earlier, if my lack of hindsight about and distance from the project results in assumptions regarding its content, or if anything feels exceedingly messy still. I'm planning to speak for about 25 minutes, give or take, but not much longer, so that there's sufficient time for questions or a discussion at the end if there's desire for that. I should say that I'll inevitably rush through quite a few concepts and ideas in order to provide a broad strokes overview instead of zooming in on anything in particular. So apologies if this will make my presentation feel overly dense, or you know, if I'll skip some important details, but I'll be happy to try and unpack any bits that people might want me to clarify or further expand on. Right, so I'm going to do essentially two things today. I'll give a brief overview of the book as a whole, explaining its premise and its origin story, so to speak, but also outlining its structure and the progression of the main through lines. And then after that, I'll read 3 short excerpts that might hopefully give a better feel for where the book is headed. Okay, so perhaps looking at the book's title is a good place to start to bring into focus the project's key elements. The book is titled Studious Use and tentatively subtitled Designing from the Undercommons. I'll get to the subtitle in just a moment, but as you might be able to guess from the title, my interest here is bringing together 2 seemingly mundane practices, use and study, in the attempt to identify unexplored points of convergence between them, on the basis of which we might then devise experimental modes of sociality. As I was doing doctoral work on forms of collective use, I came across Stefano, Harney and Fred Moten's writing on study, predominantly in the book The Undercommons, and I'm starting to notice interesting commonalities in terms of the kind of logics that both fields of practice tend to be informed, if not captured by, centering on agential instrumentality and authorship in the case of use, and on self-improvement in the case of study. It seemed to me that at the center of each was a shared commitment to individuation, which is to say the parceling out, whether encouraged or forcible, of social life into pre-existing, albeit interacting units. In part given through a prioritization either of the subjectivity and trajectory of these practices' central figure, so the user and the student respectively, or of the objects they encounter, so artifacts and knowledge predominantly, over the activities themselves, which is to say over the scene of use and the scene of study. Throughout much of their collaborative work, Harney and Moten have been at pains to disarticulate the notion of study from the terms of self-improvement and related of accreditation that institutional discourses, practices, and sites of learning and education seem entirely predicated upon. Building on this premise, they encourage us to extend our understanding of study to all forms of collective activity that are instead aimed at cultivating and circulating a general indebtedness, the shared debt underpinning a sociality that comes before and beneath instances of individuation, which is what Harney and Moten call the undercommons, mentioned in my book subtitle. So with this perspective in mind, what I wanted to understand was how this approach could also apply to and help reorient the way we participate in the scene of use. More specifically, I was interested in exploring how use, if similarly delinked from the regime of individuation that seeks to govern it and which it is often tasked to reproduce in everyday life, to be instead reconfigured as a mode of undercommon study. However, I should again clarify that the overarching intention of the book is not to prioritize use over study or study over use. In other words, this is a case neither of applying the category of use to existing formulation of study, nor vice versa of applying a rethinking of study to ongoing explorations of use, as if either of these two terms were something like a patch to remedy the other's conceptual or pragmatic inadequacies, is instead precisely the interplay between an entwining of use and study that this book sets out to explore. As the blurb for this talk said, was interested in the point where to use is to study and to study is to use, which is a practice I'm somewhat awkwardly calling studious use. Finally, the subtitle also refers to the particular angle that I'm taking to pragmatically experiment with this intersection of use and study, which is that of design, understood here as an infrastructuring practice. As I will explain shortly, although the book is largely theoretical in its approach, it also contains several accounts and reflection on examples of design and designing, including my own design practice. Okay, now let me run you through the way the argument develops throughout the book, chapter by chapter. So following an introduction, mainly outlining the ideas that I presented so far, chapter 1 lays the foundation of the argument by discussing how the logic of individuation proliferates as innocent common sense, permeating various and at times ostensibly incompatible articulations of social life. The chapter begins with an assessment of the figure of the individual and its key trait, which I understand together with Harney and Moten as the capacity and compulsion to see itself and act as the sole proprietor of its own life, as a self-possessed, self-contained entity. However, I then also note that uncritical appeals to communitarian formations as an antidote to the so-called individualism of liberal civil society not only don't always challenge the idea of sociality as a secondary and supplemental condition, but also often tend to rely on the same terms of ownership through, for example, through devices like membership to community. By contrast, the chapter considers the peculiar practice of sharedness that is at play in friendship as an important site for self-dispossessed undercommon social life. So following introduction, mainly outlining the ideas presented so far. Sorry, bit of a mix up with my slides. Sorry about that. These are my points for first chapter. Apologies for that. Driven by an intention to not only rethink but also rehearse sociality in these terms, the second chapter instead focuses on operational considerations, so to speak. Identifying design practice as something of an infrastructuring force that is particularly suited to support an exploration at the intersection of use and study. This assessment is carried out by examining key debates, as well as practices on use, found in design studies, situating the present intervention, particularly in relation to so-called critical and speculative approaches to making and pedagogic practices. The chapter then concludes by presenting an overview of design's socio-political commitments and approaches to participatory practice, offering a series of reflection on related issues and complexities. On to chapter three. Chapter three confronts the first of the book's two key elements, undertaking a reformulation of the notion of use and proposing a first set of what I call conceptual coordinates along the way. This begins with a critical appraisal of common sense imaginaries of use, and also the figure of the user, whether this is hailed as a masterful agent or disparaged as an impoverishment of the person's originary humanity. By contrast, I go on to foreground the scene of use, as I mentioned, as a primary general and generative entanglement central to process of subjectivation, but also potential, and this is the bit I'm more interested in, processes of desubjectivation. Largely drawing on George Agamben's work on use, but also on Sarah Ahmed's more recent investigation, the chapter argues that use can be a far more nuanced paradigm of acting than what its colloquially instrumental acceptation might lead us to believe. And I trace Agamben's characterization of use as a form of what he terms as a profanatory, gestural play, and ultimately as a mode of relationality predicated on being simultaneously affecting and affected by the world, which Agamben claims to radically undermine the terms of property. The fourth chapter pushes beyond Agamben's theoretical territory to address the book's second core element, which is study. Indeed, I suggest that Agamben's use presents remarkable yet under-examined analogies to Harney and Moten's undercommon or black study. Just as chapter 3 started with an undoing of functionality's instrumental hold over use by de-emphasizing the figure of the user, chapter 4 draws on critical perspectives in philosophy of education to disentangle study from individuating tropes of learning and education that hinge on the figure of the student. The ultimate intent, however, is not so much that of showing, as I was mentioning earlier, that to use is to study or vice versa. Rather, the chapter points to a fruitful overlap between certain modes of use and certain modes of study, as Eli Meyerhoff puts it. This in turn paves the way for the formulation of some additional conceptual coordinates, leading to the articulation of a studious use, a practice of growing ever more indebted to one another in a kinesthetic mode of cultivating and circulating an attention to our mutual indebtedness. Chapter 5 continues and concludes the conceptual work of chapter 3 and 4, extending and implementing it with the within the concrete context of collective experimentation with a studious use. I do so first by taking up a final triplet of coordinates that is inspired by the work of Erin Manning and Brian Mazzumi, which address interrelated questions of curation, participatory action, and issues of decision-making. And the second part of the chapter chronicles the actual planning and unfolding of a study session, which is retrospectively divided into 7 acts. And the session involved bringing together a group of friends and a purposely built kinetic machine, or at least what I call here a kinetic machine, in order to explore instances of somatic emotional interference through use. Finally, the book's coda reviews the whole exploration and articulates 2 key points. First, I propose that in the attempt of developing a mode of designing from the undercommons, the book takes on an approach to use that is not so much critical, speculative, or fictional, but rather somewhat prefigurative. This requires sidestepping the emphasis on futurity and what-ifs that much contemporary experimental design work, as well as pedagogy-oriented design hinge on, in order to instead embrace the temporality of as-ifs and the immediate rehearsal of alternative practices of sociality. Second, I argue that the coordinates for studious use presented throughout might further enrich the grammar of the social poetics unfolding before and beyond individuation. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, having presented the summary of the book's overall trajectory, I would now like to share with you 3 short excerpts, only slightly edited to fit this presentation, that can help give a sense of what I'm trying to do, as well as how I'm trying to do at least some of it. So, let me just... Okay, so the first excerpt is from the book's introduction, and I think it might be helpful in framing the project's most general approach to use as such. And here it is. Something that must be noted from the onset, if anything, because it is by and large what has sustained this book's fascination with use, is its strange conceptual and pragmatic ambiguity. Use, a polyvalent term that can point to something very concrete and very hard to pin down at once, both intuitively graspable and philosophically impervious, extremely specific and surprisingly generic. Think of the proximities and divergences between expressions such as, say, using a hammer, using a language, using the senses, using someone's help, using someone. We might say that use operates on multiple registers, at times overlapping, at other times ostensibly irreconcilable. With this in mind, rather than choosing a single perspective, let alone attempting to resolve the many tensions of which use seems to be the crucible, the present exploration will instead tend to float across such registers, which is to say, in more direct terms, if, on the one hand, the use discussed throughout does refer to the concrete, physical, pragmatic handling of 3-dimensional artifacts of various kinds, on the other hand, the book also considers, and indeed foregrounds, the broader social logic or terms of entanglement that can be at stake in use. If the former aspect perhaps does not immediately require further unpacking, some clarifications regarding the latter aspect is instead likely in order. This essentially implies treating use not only as an activity, but also as something of a more general paradigm, or better still, as a lens, an epistemic prism that might allow us to notice and intervene on particular facets of the logic of individuation that this book takes aim at. In this sense, by centering use, by giving it operational and analytic priority, the book perhaps goes some way towards furthering what our critic Stephen Wright has called a useology, which he describes as, quote, an ambulant and approximate science devoted to the study of uses and modes of usership, end quote. Okay, on to a second excerpt. This is a much longer passage, so please bear with me. It's again from the introduction, and I want to share this because I think it helps situating my attempted intervention in relation to other studies touching on the question of use, but particularly on the issue of usefulness and uselessness. Here I'm addressing Sarah Ahmed's 2019 book, What's the Use? And Erin Manning's For a Pragmatic of the Useless from 2020. In her study, Sarah Ahmed shows how use becomes implicated in, or indeed serves as a basis for, a multiplicity of phenomena, ideas, institutions, and social arrangements, functioning in each case as the vehicle for the production, reproduction, and potential disruption of specific sets of values. And is indeed a consideration of value, of what and who counts or is made to count, of what and who is valued in and through use, of how use normalizes certain value systems at the expense of others. This seems to be at the heart of Ahmed's argument. In other words, Ahmed ultimately characterizes her useology as, quote, a conversation about the value, and I would add about the valuing of things, end quote. This coalescing of use and value in the often exclusionary logic of usefulness is similarly examined by Erin Manning in her latest collection of essays, For a Pragmatic of the Useless. Here, Manning further elaborates on her previous engagement with neurodiverse life and modes of perception in an effort to disrupt normative expectations that, quote, take use value as the measure of experience. Turning to what she calls a speculative pragmatism, Manning insists on championing what is instead deemed to be useless, according to neurotypicality's frame of reference, what appears to have no use, so that other ways of living become possible. Ahmed notes that perspectives such as the one advanced by Manning are part of, quote, a long tradition of affirming useless knowledge, end quote. Itself seen as an antidote to narrow utilitarian imperatives and a rejection of instrumental rationality. Quote again, sometimes predicated on valuing contemplation and the life of the mind, and at other times predicated on valuing speculation and experimentation, end quote. And yet, Ahmed goes on to warn us, although not without its merits, this is a tradition that can frequently belie elitist undertones. Indeed, because the option of dwelling in uselessness is not equally afforded to all, quote, often class privilege has rested on the gesture of distancing oneself from utility, end quote. The seemingly diverging orientations notwithstanding, a critique of the utilitarian slant on the formulation value equals use, as well as its flip side, use equals value, where use equals utility, of how and why and where this equation gets mobilized, is arguably a crucial point of convergence for Ahmed's and Manning's projects. Whether we are alerted that to value use might require change of values, as in Ahmed's case, or encouraged to reconsider, well, what is value beyond use value, which is the core question Manning is grappling with. In both instances, what seems to be ultimately at stake is an effort to reconfigure the coupling of use and value beyond its oppressively limited boundaries. If that is indeed the case, what I want to do here is perhaps to follow a different, yet I would hope complementary route. This book thus attempts to explode the bond between use and value, leaving the latter term behind for good so as to finally ask, is it possible to think and practice a mode of use entirely outside of its Marxian association with value? Or somewhat turning Manning's question on its head, not to refute it, but to deepen it. If we altogether sidestep the vaguely Manichaean struggle between usefulness and uselessness, what is use beyond and before use value? What is use as a breaking of, quote, the compulsions of value that organize social relations? Which is also to say, what is use in excess of value, in defiance of processes of valorization? Engaging in what might well be described borrowing from the Mardi Gras listening collective as, quote, a precise derangement of the sense of use value, unquote, be a necessary step in order to make use of other users of use, as Ahmed puts it. And making use of other users of use could itself mean opening the door to other regimes of motion and perception too. In other words, reconsidering use could offer fertile ground upon which to elaborate, or rather to differently rejoin in what Harney has described as a collective organization of our senses. That is to say, a mode of sabotaging, however fleetingly and intermittently, yet never independently, the individuating experiential boundaries we are so accustomed to when thinking about use. Now, it has already been mentioned that, as Harney and Moten remind us, another word for this general sabotage, for this particular undoing, is study, the always ongoing collective renewal of our entanglement, the way we are quite literally returned to, reabsorbed in and by what is not just me. However, or rather because of this, study is also a highly contested practice. It is a terrain of struggle, and as such, it demands careful probing, much like the practice of use does. Finally, I would like to end with a short excerpt taken from chapter 4. Here I begin to assess the folding together of use and study in contemporary discourse and practice. To learn is to learn how to use something, writes Ahmed about the manner in which we are often compelled to navigate a world of functions and affordances that, whether explicitly intelligible or requiring deciphering, indicate to us the right way, the proper way, the straight way. Learning leads us to use, or rather to correct use. Ahmed's comment powerfully renders the didactic normativity the practices of use tend to command. The previous chapter attempted to destabilize, which is chapter 3, attempted to destabilize the instrumental horizon of use presupposed by this particular perspective, and relatedly, to scramble the default temporality and causality that are at stake in such a functionalist, teleological, intention-driven model. In other words, I try to contend that the scene of use does not have to be conceived as the concluding plot point in a story of volitional prehension, not necessarily as the user's accomplished exercise of mastery and sovereignty over, hence extrication from, the world, but perhaps also as a form of pragmatic re-immersion into the richness of social life. Now, when considering the overview of designerly attitudes toward use presented in chapter 2, it could be argued that inverting the terms of relationship in Ahmed's above formulation produces an equally valid claim, namely that to use is to learn. Using to learn is indeed a staple methodology across very different approaches to design, whether it is from a user-centered, ethnographic, informal, or speculative design angle. The scene of use is frequently enlisted in the pursuit of various kinds of learning objectives, gathering user-generated data for product innovation, eliciting unexpected insight into people's everyday experiences, identifying opportunities for tactical misuse, and teaching citizens about democratic participation are some of the examples I discussed earlier on. An intention to question what might be left unexamined in this use as learning paradigm, as well as to then articulate an alternative conception of what could be characterized as user studiousness, is the main focus of this chapter. And that is all from me today. That is all I've got.
Cool. Thank you for that.
I'll stop sharing. So for a second, I thought I had been disconnected. I couldn't see the main window for the call. But,
cool.
Right.
Well, I'll kick us off with a sort of thought question conversation bit. I like what you're doing, and so what I think about study and the way Harney and Moten use it, you have activities where you don't necessarily have a set goal or end, right? So it's not studying for the exam, it's studying because you don't even know why, right? Or just something you do together without a set end or necessarily like you aren't disciplined by a sort of end product. And when I think about design practices, usually I'm thinking about, versus designing, how you interact with something, how the user interacts with the thing, and anticipating what they do or don't do. But my understanding, if you're trying to design in a sort of in a studious manner, it's almost like you're trying to anticipate or be open to how the user might want to break, reappropriate, reuse, use in some way you couldn't imagine. So it's almost like trying to take away that sort of expectation and leave it open. Is that a fair rendering or?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're touching on one of what, in my mind, the most critical points that I'm trying to, in many ways, that I've been trying to wrap my head around, which is whether design can kind of extract itself from kind of a normative impulse almost, or like a prescriptive impulse, or maybe what Harney and Moten would say is design is a form of policy, right? It's a form of deciding what others have to do, prescriptive type of activity. This is why I mentioned that I'm trying to treat design as an infrastructuring pursuit. And the way, maybe I should kind of clarify what I mean by that. And I know there's a pretty extensive literature on the concept and practices of infrastructuring. And I'm not necessarily going to kind of open that kind of worms, but basically the distinction I'm trying to make is between a design that structures experience and therefore that defines how things should be used and what people ought to do with whatever they encounter, and a form of design as infrastructure, which is to say a design that generates certain conditions of possibilities for things to begin to unfold. I think there's this very interesting way that I think that Erin Manning has to, and Brian Matsumi too, to talk about what they do in their Sense Lab. I'm not sure if it's still called Sense Lab or if it's now the 3 Ecology Institute or whatever it is at the moment. But and they were talking about similar issues that they encounter in the curation of their events, and how they can both not fall for like anything goes type of thing where they say if anything goes nothing will come, but also to try and curate certain points of entry into a collective practice. And they talk about this in terms of enabling constraints, and this is very much the same way I'm seeing design. So designing enabling constraints, designing certain features maybe that can prompt people to start doing things together in certain conditions without necessarily saying what has to come out of it. And the last thing I would say, so if I'm rambling for a very long time, is that I'm very interested in how both use and study tend to be kind of connected to a discourse of attention. And what I find really interesting is considering attention as not the opposite of distraction, but actually something that is brought about by distraction, and distraction being something that pulls you out of this, in my mind at least, illusory sense that you are in your body, that you are a self-contained individual, but that returns one to the general entanglement that we are part of, and therefore draws your attention to the fact that there's not just you in the scene of use, so to speak. Don't know if that makes sense, but hopefully that answered your question.
It also makes me think about that how you bring in Agamben there. I'm thinking also, you didn't mention it, but like things like Agamben's writing about Jakob van Uxel, where he talks about the ticks, right? And ticks are very open to the world, but being open to the world doesn't mean they can do anything. It means they can do like one or two things. So that would be almost kind of like an enabling constraint. It's like how that operates, which is both open, but particular kinds of openness. Yeah, that's interesting. Peter?
No, I apologize, because after this question, I do need to catch a train actually to Essex. But I guess I have two aspects that I wanted to raise, because I really like what you're doing, and I like how you're trying to frame this. But so some of this is just being a bit of devil's advocate. And I think it's not a bad thing that we have a quite excellent marketing scholar here, also Mario, because some of what I'm asking may actually touch on this a bit, which is that, you know, what you're describing, if you took out the kind of radical political critique aspect, or is actually what design largely is, right? Like, in a certain sense, when you're designing a new technology, which I've had the unfortunate of doing, I mean, essentially you create sites of minimum value, like products that people can use, that actually allows for an emergence of different instrumental uses, right? And then, I mean, they don't tell you this. This is kind of like what actually then is at stake in terms of, well, we've created this thing, let's see how people actually use it. And you're open to the surprise of it, right? However, and I hate to use this word, but I will for a moment, the kind of branding of it is that, oh, well, this product is going to do this, right? And so there's a certain dynamic in which what you're talking about is fundamental to what design is in the contemporary period anyway, right? But for people to engage in this, it has to actually be quite different than what, you know, what design is, because people have a subjective and subjectified experience of what design should be that is instrumental, that is very prescriptive, when in fact anybody who designed anything knows that that's exactly the opposite, right? Like, you don't know what you're designing until people start using it, and then they come up with what its use is, right? So I'm wondering, is this a dynamic that can be used for your radicalization, in terms of like, do we have to just take this something that already capitalists are using and put it towards actually the kind of commons? Or do you think it's important to actually create not just a kind of structural materialized experience of design as this for radical purposes, but also its radical discursive framing, right? Because those are somewhat two separate things, right? And obviously, I think sometimes if we're speaking in normative terms or other political terms from the left, we're quite more interested in the presentation of ideology than capitalism is, right? Capitalism really doesn't care. It'll brand what it's actually doing in any way, right? So the new use of design in capitalism is, we have no idea what these products are going to do. We're actually using your labor to figure it out for us, but we're going to brand it as something that we have complete knowledge of and very instrumental. The other, I would say, though, more substantive point is, are we too quickly subsuming value and exploitation? And what I mean by that is that, at least I think within Stefano Harney's work and Fred Morton's work, right, I think that there's a notion, or at least an implicit discussion of value in relation to undercommons. And I think about like their essay on, you know, being in but not of a university, right? That I don't think necessarily rejects value, but is using this kind of almost heterotopic liminal relationship in a way to redefine and allow value to be emergent as opposed to prescribed, right, in a non-exploitive way. And so, I mean, I was just thinking, is there a need to kind of unpack that? Because I don't think necessarily you're talking about value, you're talking about a particular mode of value creation, right? Necessarily to value in and of itself. I don't know if those made sense, but
They really do. Well, first of all, thank you for coming along. And if at any moment during my attempt at responding to your comments, you need to rush, please feel free to do so. But yeah, no, these are both excellent points. In part, things that I've never thought about, at least in those terms. So thank you for that, because it offers me an opportunity to do so. And partly things I've been grappling with, and maybe that the presentation also didn't cover very much. So I'll try my best to kind of to explain how I think in relation to what you said, maybe in reverse. So starting from the question of subsuming value and exploitation. Yeah, that's a good point. It's an interesting way to look at it. I think there's several moments where Harney and Moten in various texts talk about a sociality centered on the invaluable. And well, two things. The first one is that, as I try to explain both in this presentation, definitely I try my best to do it in the book, that I don't want to be I don't want to put forward universalizing kind of claims and normative approaches and say this is what we should be doing at all time from now on. I don't think I wouldn't want to be misunderstood. That claim is like there's something wrong if you need to put up a picture to use your hammer to with intent and and hammer a nail on the wall, whatever. So I'm not necessarily trying to say this is all bad, this is all good. And the same goes with value. I guess maybe in response to what you're saying, maybe it's true that the thing I've got more problems with is processes of valorization rather than value itself. And in the context of study, maybe the question of the fact that once there is the ripening of value, then that's the end of study, if that makes sense. And inevitably, I would say, well, inevitably, my sense is that that moment of valorization is the way in which you ripen the profit and of what you've been doing. And I'm not so sure that that can be a collective profit. I wonder if the moment of valorization is the moment where individuation kicks in. So yeah, I guess that's the point for me about trying to stay with the invaluable and try to see what is possible when we kind of disentangle our study and studious use practices, if you like, from this search for value. Now, it might be the value is an effect of what we're doing, which is, it's also fine. I can't remember who, but there's a quote I have in the book that says it might be Ahmed. It says the function of use might not be the point of use. Or the effect of use might not be the point of use. So hopefully that kind of says something about your comment on the tension between value and exploitation. The other point on what design actually is, I really like how you put it, and almost made me feel like thinking about actually existing design as opposed to it's like discursive understanding of design. So you were asking about whether we need to, if I understood correctly at least, whether we needed to also operate on the level of the discursive. And I think my answer would be yes, without prioritizing how we do things versus how we talk about things. But I think the two, at least in my mind, need to go together. And part of the reason for that is that I see, and I discuss in the book, practice that I find very interesting, and that in some ways are very similar to what I'm trying to do, but that the way you see, partly because of how they describe and they understand what they're doing, is kind of trapped in this, in a certain kind of pursuit of learning something. Then what they end up doing and how they end up organizing the type of practice that they're designing is meant to stage ends up being quite different. And for example, there's some design practice that they're very interested in playfulness, but then that playfulness is then instrumentalized, and it's like, oh, but you know, with playfulness we can get very unexpected responses from users that we can then use to, you know, to design differently. And I mean, for example, I'll be interested in playfulness as such. Just finally, some of what you were saying about the fact that designers don't actually, at least if they're honest, don't actually pretend to know how what they design will actually be used. I think that's completely true. And in fact, there's a lot of really good critical literature on the kind of discrepancy between designers' intention and what actually happens in the scene of use, and how users tend to reappropriate and be creative in their use practices, obviously starting from Deserto and the whole debate and tactic and strategy. But there's also, there's been recently a lot of discussion about so-called adhocism and, you know, improvisational misuse and all these kinds of things, which I find very interesting and very, and as you're saying, they kind of are very similar to what I'm trying to do, and without but. Although the only thing I would say is that they all tend to then revert to this kind of strategic or rather tactical ethos that the user has, where the prioritization is again who the user is. The user is this creative creature that, you know, that interprets and reinterprets affordances and all the rest of it for, you know, certain purposes. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm interested in the open-endedness of study. So I guess that's where I'm kind of gently part ways, so to speak, from that kind of approach that foregrounds the creativity of the user. I don't know if that kind of
no, it does make sense, and I think it's part of a broader discussion. But no, it's very interesting, and I'm looking forward to the book a lot, because I think when I read it, some of these things are even going to come out more clearly. So right on. Thank you very much. And
thank you.
Sorry, everyone. I gotta run. Unfortunately, not run. I literally have to walk fast to the train. I'll speak everyone soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. I see Michael has a question, but just one thought before I hand it over to me, Michael, is have you seen this book, Images of Class by Jacopo Galimberti?
The name rings a bell. I might know of it, but definitely I have not read it.
You might want to take a look at it, because it's really interesting in discussions about the mid part of it about overlaps of architecture, design practices, and autonomia in this sort of 60s and 70s, which a lot of things that I have to admit that I didn't really know about, and also sort of how approaches to design that in people's, let's say, professional lives then sort of bled into their politics, and that's
Right.
I find quite interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll definitely have a look at that. I might have to, if I don't find it right away, I'll email you to get the full title.
Cool.
Yep. Thank you.
Michael?
Yeah, so I appreciated the third excerpt because it started to give examples of things that were being designed or used. Like, so if it is the use is learning from use is learning for the use of some object, then I think it would be it's very helpful to understand the examples from the objects. And I wonder, I heard the word use value, you know, in terms of the sort of difference between use value and exchange value that comes up classically in leftist understandings of economics. And I think it would be interesting to look at design through the idea that when multiple people use objects, they use them differently. And certainly the theory that the value of an object is, in a sense, performed by different people because they use the object to create a world with it. That use of the object is a creation of a world, and those are the contested values that are in objects, and that's really seems kind of what David Graeber's theory of value comes out of in terms of the that book Towards an Anthropological Theory of Value. So I kind of wanted to like flag out you know, sort of an example that is kind of tangible, maybe might be engineering design in the mid 1970s, where it's quite famous case in the UK. The Lucas Aerospace workers were going to be laid off, and so they tried to campaign for a plan that the workers wrote themselves, and they actually designed prototypes of these materials, and it was socially useful production. So not only were they using that object to actually do things like you know, heat exchanges for working class housing projects, on rail off-road vehicles, what else do they have? Underwater vehicles, kidney machines, windmills, but they're also using the entire design process to highlight the unfairness of that. So I think that I'd be interested to see how study creates is in fact conditioned by the kind of unfortunate conditions that we're in, that the object is a site of contested values, and the exchange can be a site of contested values. So those are all that. And here's some design of some contested values over here. Behind me is the design of a picket line in front of a union, in front of a university. That's a design of a university, which is quite contested. And here's the design of food that is for people out on the street who feel hungry, and you can just have it. So those are the design, as well as the all around me, the design of things and that trees and all kinds of stuff. But like the idea of I just want to flag tangibly like the objects in that, and maybe you could speak a little bit about what how you see really understanding your work as coming out of the objects that we design.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I'm not sure I've got a satisfactory answer to what you're asking, but I'll try my best. Well, but first of all, you pointed out the question of use value and exchange value, and I'm not terribly versed on the debates in Marxist theory around the labor theory of value and value as such, but there's one thing that as I was writing that I was quite interested in is how I remember, I think it's I can't remember, there's someone that points out that for Marx that there is the moment of use value and exchange value, they come together. So the problem is value is not so much that we need use value rather than exchange value, but that it's use value and exchange value can only come together, can only come out together through the process of valorization. So there's no such thing as far as I understand, the way I understand it at least, and please correct me if I misunderstood it, but there's no such thing as use value as use value as a unit, as a concept, without its counterside as exchange value. And I thought that was interesting, and there's the way why I was trying to see in one of the excerpts, can we disentangle and decouple use from its association with value, which must also have the way I understand it, must also have its flip side as exchange value. But another thing I wanted to...
I mean, just jump in here right here, and I think that's a great direction. But like and I think I would point to the sort of David Graeber's kind of framework, which is certainly very close to Marxism, but like I mean, we could have endless arguments on Marxism,
yeah.
But it does seem like much of the early Marx was designed to talk to the economics that it was being forced to do. It was designed, Marxism as a theory was designed to talk to and undermine economics, but it comes out looking a lot like that. And so it's really that contest between values, that people have different values in the world, and then value, which is what is a measurable thing. And and when we can look at exchange value as just one of the different values in the world, and it's a use value of an object is to get more exchange. And it's almost capitalism only has one use value for every object it creates. So in that sense, so I think really that breaking away from the value of an object and just saying that in some sense the value, you're blowing the word between value and values, the value of the object is the world that it creates, which is the use values. And I think that's how those contested multiple uses help create values. So I do think it's not necessary to get trapped in specifically the value of an object, but it does show how my question, how it's phrased, does create that problem, because I said the value of an object rather than No,
I think you're making a good point, and yeah. So I feel like I started rambling a bit, and But anyways, so I get what you're saying. By the way, I remember it's an essay by Spivak, the one I was referring to, where she talks about the moment of valorization as birthing both use value and exchange value. In any case, what I was going to say that maybe kind of responds or riffs off what you were saying that I found very interesting in your initial comment was because you pointed out to difference and difference and contestation and difference in values, and I should say that this is a gesture that I think in Harney and Moten and in people like Denise Ferreira da Silva, very important, that this thing that Denise Ferreira da Silva talks about in terms of difference without separation, difference without separability, what I find very interesting there, important there, is the emphasis on difference and differentiation, and how there needs to be room for both. Well, we need to be able to hold together both a rejection of individuation, but also a kind of a celebration of differentiation at once, so that we don't end up with that kind of very rigid communitarian type of formation. And the reason why I'm saying this is because part of the stuff that I was talking about earlier about enabling constraint and all the rest of it is the idea of saying, okay, so can I design certain conditions of possibility that are common, that are collectively encountered, but they also leave room for all sorts of, if we want, exits from that collective moment, they leave room for differentiation, so that, you know, we are engaged in a form of studious use altogether, but it doesn't mean that we need to then end up with, you know, the same experience, that we come out of it all kind of unified and uniform and all the rest of it. I'm not completely sure, as I'm talking about this, how that relates to your very interesting point on in examples of, in engineering design. I'll give it some more thought. I don't know if I can talk more about that, but yeah, I think that's all, that's all I got in response to what you were saying. But thanks.
I think with the Lucas plan example, it's almost like you're kind of flipping the issue. Instead of thinking about how you just start with an outcome and how an object and how you use it, it's almost like, here are the technical skills and capacities these workers have, and they're trying to rethink the use of those skills in a different framework, so that's not subject to, or I guess you say, you mentioned they've been put to use in a certain way, and they're trying to say, okay, let's, if we took it out of that context and put it elsewhere, so it's, rather than being rethinking the objects, rethinking the skills that underpin the object.
Yeah, and I think maybe analytically speaking as well, I don't know if this doesn't do justice to this particular example, but maybe it's also, and I don't know if this relates to what Peter was saying earlier, but it's also a question of thinking about whether we want to focus on what these workers ended up doing, what they ended up producing, or whether we want to also focus on, and this might be very relevant to the Culver research cluster in particular, or whether we want to focus on the moment of coming together and saying, well, we're not going to do that, we're going to do something else, and so we're going to start using our skills in another way without necessarily putting our focus on the outcome of that using of skills, if that makes sense. And maybe we could say that, you know, that there's something interesting in the way they studied their skills, and something came out of that, but maybe that's not the most important or the most interesting thing, at least from the perspective of what I'm doing in my book. It wouldn't be. Doesn't mean there's not equally important, but I guess maybe one thing I'm trying to do with my book, if I were to read that example through, what I'm trying to do with my book is that I'm interested in the moment before, the outcome of this collaborative reinvention of their skills, and yeah.
Maybe if I could just add to or qualify Stephen's point, part of it was not just rethinking their skills, but rethinking their position. They had a factory that did objects and they were going to lose their job. So they were like, how do we redo this? And so the idea of remaking the objects was also what use they wanted to come out of that whole situation. So I guess their claim on socially useful production, that objects should be useful, was a claim to say my life should be useful in when I'm working with this, I should have a job. So I just that the some of the understanding of the object comes out of the contested values of what it should be. And I guess it's both that it's not just the object is contested, it's the object, as you say, is contested before it's made in the design process. So which is something I guess your work makes clearer for me when I hear this discussion.
What I find interesting about with the Lucas example is a number of the things they end up designing, like heat pumps in electric cars, are things that were viewed as being utopian and unrealistic unworkable in that time. But now that there are things people are all excited about, so it's almost like they were working on things that were like maybe 30 years ahead of where the world was, and it needed a different context, But maybe that's not helpful. Oh, Mario moved to my screen. Okay, there you are. Okay, Mario.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very interesting conversation and very interesting book. It's not my area at all. So as Peter said, I'm one of those instrumental guys from marketing. So probably one of the bad ones. So I find it very interesting, this entire conversation, and there are so many different angles, but I find it rather broad. So I'm still a bit confused in terms of what being very instrumental here in quotation marks. So what is the purpose of this all? What is your target audience for the kind of reflections on study and use and studious use and combining that and overcoming individuation and focusing on the more collective act in the design before it's actually put to use by whoever? So that's my first point. So who are the kind of target groups from a marketing point of view for that kind of reflection? So so that's one thing that I'm a bit confused about, because you're very broad. I find it also very interesting in terms of, you talked about in the conversation here after your presentation that you talked about use and use value and value, use as a concept, studying as a concept, and then value was crept in again, because of course we know about exchange value and use value and the rest of it. And that questions, of course, how do we define value in the first place? And if that is expanded, that changes the conversation. It's the same as you are questioning the definition of use, and that changes the conversation. But what's missing for me, because you focus so much on individuation and overcoming that in the kind of capitalist neoliberal order that is very much about the singular, and I think Reckwitz has talked about this, the society of the singularity, and not in the sense of a technical singularity, but in terms of that this aesthetic value of being perceived as unique while not being really unique. Is such an important part of how we differentiate ourselves in this kind of neoliberal society. But what I'm more not about is meaning. I think is a term, is a concept that is missing here, because objects through their use acquire meaning for us, and we act on that meaning and not just on the instrumental use of using a hammer to get a nail into the wall. And that is also part of the reappropriation of objects. If we change the meaning they have for us, and that's what consumers very often do, they incorporate consumer products, branded products into their daily lives, because those objects acquire meaning for them. And it is not confined to what marketers tell them those objects should be. They do something with it. So the use, and that is what the debate in marketing is about. It's a debate about value in use. And that is the consumer perspective in terms of what do consumers actually do with those products or the services that they use, and how is that actually adding value or creating value in the first place, and not the kind of value that is being created in a factory, like the traditional Marxian view of that. So marketing itself has moved in that direction very much, that they talk about the value in use, used by the user, whoever that user is. And that is where the value is actually created in the first place. So that's another thing that I find quite interesting to reflect on. And then I also, and that's more kind of my general, and I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a sociologist, so forgive me that I can't recite you all these kind of great thinkers. But really what I also find is this definition of design, I think, is also rather broad and unspecific. So design can be many things. Design can be an object, design can be a plan, design can be a process and an activity. Design can be the thing that you do as much as the outcome of it. So I think our common sense understanding of design is highly problematic here, because it overlaps for me also with questions of acting, working, producing, and those are analytically quite different kind of concepts. And I'm just thinking about Anna Arendt's notion of vita activa, and the way we as Homo faber are very restrictive in the capitalist system, but it doesn't mean as human beings that acting, producing artifacts is part of what makes us humans in the first place. And I think this, your question of the combining use with learning or studying, as far as I understand it, and being in that process of, by doing so, shaping the world and changing the world. I think that is part of the human condition. And again, here for me is not just this act of doing things and creating artifacts through our creative imagination, instrumental or otherwise. That also meaning comes in again for me is because we are socialized animals, and these shared meanings of the objects that we create and how we put them to use affects that as well. So maybe Hannah Arendt's work on vita activa could be some interesting angle in addition to what you've been doing. But again, I'm not claiming that I'm anywhere near an expert on that or have any kind of other than common sense understanding of those issues. But I find it quite fascinating to ask the question. So congratulations to that.
Thank you. I mean, there's a lot of very thought-provoking comments there. I'll try my best to touch on your points. Not sure how well I will do, but whatever I don't manage to respond to, thank you, because there's particularly given that the book is not finished yet, that'll give me food for thought going forward and kind of trying to wrap everything up. So somewhat in disorder, if you don't mind, the question of design that you mentioned, I come from design, although I don't know if I'm passing for a philosopher or sociologist, and definitely a lot of my work is kind of ventures into those disciplines. But I trained as a designer, and at least formally, I worked as a designer. I tutor in a design department here at Edinburgh. So design is mostly, one would say, my home discipline, so to speak. And I've been involved in this discipline for, was it now, since 2005 when I started my BA. So what is that, nearly 20 years now. And at some point I got really fascinated up to a certain point, and then started to be a bit bored about disciplinary efforts to understand what design is. And anyone who's looked into design, who is in design, who's read about design, has encountered at least a few attempts at ontologizing or saying like, this is what design really is. And often in contrast with like, this is art, or this is craft, and this is design, and and to be honest, that's fine. I mean, I don't want to tell people not to talk about these things. It's certainly, I think, is an interesting question. I find the answers usually less interesting than the question and the questioning themselves. In my book, I do discuss a bit how I deal with design, and I've had discussions with Stephen in the past about how I approach design, and I definitely don't want to engage in a reframing of this like inward looking kind of definition of what design is, or partly because I think it could be many different things, and I'm completely fine with that. And I think you mentioned quite a few, and you're absolutely right. And so maybe this is a bit of a cop-out, but the book is not trying to redefine the discipline as a whole. And this connects to what you were saying at the beginning about the target group. Even though I think I do try to speak to designers, perhaps to enlist some of them in trying to explore this particular way of designing that in my mind is a bit different, is very similar to certain types of experimental design that I mentioned. They're usually referred to as critical and speculative design. They then turn into something that some people call design fiction. And I think there's a lot of interesting work being done there. It's been going on for quite a while. And I'm hoping that my approach to design and designing can add something to that debate and can, you know, produce work that is similar but somewhat different in, you know, what design is, what's the place of design as a form of activity in how we think about and organize collectivity mainly. You mentioned two other points. One was on individuation and one was on the meaning of products. And yeah, I think they're somewhat connected. You connected them, I think, better than I could rehearse. I'm not going to try, but yeah, I think you're completely right that there's something in the process of meaning creation and definition and redefinition in use. I talk quite a bit about, as I mentioned earlier, about these forms of informal or kind of ad hocist approaches to design. They seem to be very much about that process, about kind of not just receiving a meaning as it's intended to be, but kind of finding kind of unique ways, as I think you used the word unique ways of kind of entangling our lives with objects, with products in various ways. So I think that's a very good perspective to have. And maybe the way in which it refers to the question of individuation is something that maybe I should clarify, that the point that I'm trying to make, certainly, and that I think some of the people that I'm inspired by, that I draw on, like Harney and Moten, but many others too, is not to deny as I was saying, the differentiation, which we might describe as this like unique meaning making practices and all the rest of it, without trying to be too pedantic about words, but it is rather the fact that, in my mind, individuation is the moment we think that uniqueness, that difference comes first. And so that first we are different and we are unique, and then we enter into these relationships, these forms of sociality. Whereas I think what I'm trying to say is that no, that difference, which if we want, we might call that uniqueness, is the outcome of a prior entanglement, a prior social practice. There's always shifting, and I guess that's maybe how I would frame my perspective on these points.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think there's no, you're right, there's no definitive answers to these questions. And I think it's a philosophical, almost metaphysical question, but it's also a very material question in the kind of thing that you described, but also in the, for me personally, this is my personal opinion. I think, you know, this individuation, this individuality, which is, of course, we are socialized into living in this kind of society that we live in. I think for me is a pathology of not understanding the human condition, actually, and our thoroughly socialized being. And in addition to that, of course, our thoroughly, I wouldn't so be biological, but our connection to the rest of the kind of context within which we are not just isolated beings, but we are part of that in a relational sense. So I agree with you, it's very difficult to untangle that. But I think, and I find it very interesting that to hear your perspective from this as a designer, because very often in marketing and in other areas that we talk about design and this is what designers do, but we never really engage with them. And so that you receive if you're in a commercial context, you receive the brief from the marketing department, and then you do something with it, but they have rarely engaged with the creative process itself, which is a big of a problem for me personally. But they try to appropriate your knowledge, the kind of knowledge that you're, this acquisition of knowledge for for and opening up new opportunities by doing so. They try to appropriate that again, and you probably don't like that, because there's this great debate in business and in marketing as well on design thinking and using design principles in instrumental ways in order to increase whatever productivity or targets they have. So there, and of course, you're right, that limits the kind of potential that this way of thinking could have for doing things completely differently, but that of course is not in the interest of those people who run our organizations these days. So I very much welcome your contribution to that, because I think there's we are missing the trick if we are not really reaching out beyond our disciplinary silos. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cool. Well, I have more things to ask, but I'm going to hold off on them. So for the moment. So I think maybe if it's okay, we can call it a day, and us assembled masses can thank Giovanni and is there anything else, Giovanni?
No, not really. I mean, I'm sure we'll get a chance to, definitely with you, Stephen, hopefully with the others who attended today, to continue these conversations that, you know, as my mind is the most interesting part. And I kind of every time you kind of, I guess I want to kind of rush through the moment when I talk about my perspective, and then it's, you know, the sociality that comes after that is the most interesting, the most important moment. I know it might sound a bit trite, but it's true to me. So, you know, there's I guess there's my email address there, and I'm very happy, Stephen, for you to pass it on to whoever, if there's anyone that would want to send follow-up comments or whatnot, and I'm sure with you we'll get a chance to speak again in the near future. But yeah, thanks again.
Cool.
Thank you very much.